Actually, never mind. We're going to start now. It looks like we figured out our technical issues. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Phillip Bloom. I have the unusual, I guess, pleasure of introducing myself. I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Garden Studies and the curator of the Chinese garden here at the Huntington. And usually I introduce the speakers in our lecture series. Today I happen to be the speaker. So I guess I'll tell you something about myself. Before I came to the Huntington, I was an assistant professor of East Asian art history at Indiana University in Bloomington. I received my PhD from Harvard University in Chinese art history in 2013. Strangely enough, my specialty is actually Song Dynasty Buddhist art. And honestly, through a job interview, I ended up becoming interested in gardens. When I interviewed at Indiana, I was asked whether I could teach a course on the history of garden making in East Asia. And because I wanted the job, I said, of course I can. Which was, like half true. I had an interest in gardens already. I was really interested in rocks, and I still am. And actually, I guess either the second or the fourth semester I was in Indiana, I did end up teaching a course on the history of East Asian garden making. And that actually really helped me to kind of prepare for the job at the Huntington, which I became aware of a year or so after that. But today I'm going to be talking about something that's not exactly my specialty, but something that I've become very interested in recently, which is a painting whose detail you see right now. It's a painting that we're provisionally calling Zhou Dunyi Admiring Lotuses, created by the painter Qiu Ying in the 16th century. So my talk today is, in a sense, very simple. I just want to introduce this one painting. It's a work that the Huntington recently acquired. We acquired it in, I think, May of last year, and it's actually on display right now in the Huntington Art Gallery, the mansion. It's a 16th century Chinese painting in ink and colors on silk. It shows a scholar relaxing in a pavilion overlooking a lotus pond at the height of summer. And it's a painting that's by one of the most important artists of the 16th century, Qiu Ying. After the talk today, or actually tomorrow when the gardens reopen, you can actually go see the painting in person. It's on display for about another month. And I very much hope that the talk today will provide some kind of context for understanding it. Unlike, I guess, many of the speakers in this lecture series, I don't have a particular argument that I'm making today. Instead, I'm going to just lead you through the process of unpacking this particular painting. And to be honest, this isn't a painting that I found very interesting when I first saw it. I thought it was beautiful. I thought the subject matter fit the Huntington in an almost uncannily perfect way. But the painting itself didn't really seem to be all that unusual to me, and it didn't really seem to hold any of the sorts of secrets that an art historian usually hopes a painting will hold if they intend to write or speak about it. But as I've been spending time with this painting, it's really opened up in a lot of unexpected ways. It turns out that it includes some visual curiosities that I think point in unexpected directions. But at the same time, it's also a painting that's totally mute. I mean, every painting literally is mute. But in this case, this is a painting that has almost no words inscribed on it. There's no poem to tell us what it means. There's not even a title inscribed on the exterior of the mount. It's not a painting that shows up in historical records. There aren't even seals impressed on it to tell us who owned it. So almost nothing that I say today can actually be proven. But I think through some other kinds of visual comparisons, I am able to make some sort of argument about it. And in particular, I think that through the process of reading the painting and through the process of actually speculating about it, we might actually be able to think about how to approach a lot of Chinese paintings more generally. So let's just start with some basics. What I'm going to say now is all factual. What I'm going to say later might not be. But this stuff you can trust. So first, this is a hanging scroll. It's a vertical work that's meant to be hung on a wall. And like most Chinese hanging scrolls, it's meant to be read from bottom to top. So the foreground is at the bottom of the work. The background is at the top, and then there are sort of shifting perspectives along the way. The main subject of the painting is a scholar in summer who's cooling himself by a lotus pond. You can see that behind him there's a little attendant figure who's bringing either tea or wine. Behind the attendant, there's a table that includes a box of books and a celadon vase. The style of the celadon vase is sort of a Song Dynasty style. And these are, the book and the vase are objects that allude to the scholar's erudition and his taste, and also possibly the time period in which the painting is set. You can see there are a lot of different trees. They're all differentiated. We have definitely willow up here. There's probably a maple, and then there are a couple of others that I can't quite identify. Of course, the pond is filled with lotuses that are rendered in various degrees of opening. There are some buds, there are some fully opened flowers. There are some flowers whose petals are already falling. Further up, kind of moving into the background, we come across this grand mountain that has, eccentric, almost dynamic cliffs. Even though it's rock, it really seems to be filled with an unexpected kind of energy. There's a waterfall that cascades from this mountaintop that really seems to cool down the painting as a whole. I think you're meant to imagine hearing the sound of the water falling, but also feeling the rush of cool air from that water that's falling from the mountaintop. And then in the more distant background, we see these low ridges of mountains that suggest the end of the waterway that constitutes most of the painting. The other main point of narrative interest is actually a small farmer figure. It's someone in a kind of boat that looks like an upturned hat, and he's picking some kind of water vegetable. He stands really in striking contrast to the scholar. He's a very rough, hairy, bulbous-looking figure who's very different from the kind of refined scholar in the foreground. And we'll be returning to this figure extensively in the second half of the talk. So overall, it's really an exquisite landscape. It's classical in its structure and in its execution, and I'll show in a moment its kind of classical style. But I just also want to talk briefly about how it's painted. It's a work that's also classical in its medium. It's rendered with ink and mineral and vegetal colors on silk. You can see in the detail of the farmer, you can actually see very clearly the warp and the weft fibers of the silk. It's densely woven, plain weave silk. It's a common kind of painting ground for polychrome works, really of about the 11th century onward, at least. It's possibly a studio production. You can get that sense by looking actually at the farmer himself. In passages, you can see that there is a very light underdrawing in a light shade of ink, and then probably that was probably done by the master of the studio. Then pigments were applied over that underdrawing. Typically pigments were applied by other members of a studio. And then finally, the head of the studio would come back to the painting and trace all of the outlines, either in ink or sometimes in other colors. And what I love about the farmer is that you can see that there are both the ink outlines of his arms, but then they've also done a second outline of kind of a reddish pink to highlight the flesh tones. So you get a little bit of a sense of the three-dimensionality of his body thanks to those multiple colors of outlines. The ink, kind of soaks into the silk, whereas the mineral pigments sit on top of it. And if you look at the blue of the farmer's robe, you can really see how granular and almost sandy the pigments are. The color washes themselves are generally done with mineral pigments, but there were probably also vegetal pigments that were applied as well. And those vegetal pigments are able to create kind of more nuanced colors, but they tend not to be color fast. They tend to fade pretty quickly. So most of what you're seeing in terms of color in this painting is thanks to the mineral pigments that don't really fade. In certain passages in the painting, the density of the pigmentation becomes almost tapestry-like. I think it's kind of interesting to imagine how the painter went about creating this composition and how he had to plan to create, the particular lines of the branches and trunks, and then came back and layered so many different kinds of leaves over the top. It requires a lot of imagination and foresight to create such a tapestry of pigments. And then finally, I just wanted to point out that actually, in some places, the pigments have flaked off of the painting, which sounds like a bad thing, but in a sense, it's very instructive because, again, it kind of shows us how the work was created. And in particular, there are certain passages in the foreground where the pigments of the lotuses have flaked off. And you can begin to see that actually the composition shifted slightly as the painter was working on it. So, for example, highlighted in blue here, there's the line that traces the exterior of the balustrade of this waterside pavilion. And you can see that the contour actually changed as the artists were working on it. Similarly, this lotus blossom that's highlighted in yellow was obviously applied over the top of one of the intercolumnar braces on this pavilion. So as the painters were working on the work, they were making compositional choices and subtly altering the original design. And we can see all of that precisely because it's such an old work and because pigments have started to flake off over time. And then the other kind of, I guess, interesting thing to point out is that, of course, a Chinese painting isn't just a painting. It also includes a mount that functions both as a frame and a kind of protection for the painting itself. And in this case, we're very lucky that the mount itself is quite old. The dealer who sold the painting speculates that it's possibly the original mount for the painting from the 16th century. It's actually even though it's just plain white silk, it's a really luxurious mount because it's a single piece of silk. So they took this very large piece of silk and then actually cut out a kind of window-like shape for the painting itself, rather than piecing together multiple pieces of smaller silk. Further, when you see the painting in the gallery, you'll notice that at the very top of the work, there's this kind of dark band. And that's because on the back side of the mount is actually a piece of brocade that you see on the right. It's also a very old piece of brocade, probably from the mid-16th century as well. And what's wonderful about this is that when the painting is rolled up, what you actually, as you see in this photograph at upper right, what you actually see is that brocade. So when you pick up the painting out of storage and you're beginning to hang it, the first thing you touch is that very old piece of brocade. And then you open it, and within that package, you find this exquisite painting. This is something that's not all that common for hanging scrolls. It's much more common with hand scrolls that you actually touch much more. But the inclusion of that brocade on the backside of the mount really makes it a kind of luxury object. So, I mean, in short, it's really a beautiful, finely executed painting with this kind of luxurious mount, luxurious pigmentation. It's a wonderful work. Somewhat unusually, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there's not much writing on the painting. Typically, Chinese works will have some kind of poetic inscription, either by the artist or by a later admirer. Usually there will at least be a collector's seal that will show who owned the painting when it was first produced or who owned it in subsequent centuries. There's even a space on this painting to inscribe a title, and that space is left uninscribed. So it's a bit unusual in that respect, but the painting does directly tell us who made it. The painting is signed, but it's not dated. In very, very small characters at lower left is the signature that you see in the photograph at right. There are 5 characters, and then there are 2 seals. It says Qiu Ying Shifu crafted this, and then the seals read Shifu, and then Shizhou Xianshi, the immortal of Shizhou. If you're not, essentially, in the past, most Chinese people, actually many people throughout East Asia, would have multiple names over the course of their life. They would be given a name, and this is at least true in the elite classes. So typically a person would be given a name at birth. When they went through the rites that sort of transformed them into an adult, they would receive a second name. And then during their adulthood, they might choose multiple names for themselves, either to commemorate stages of their life or to commemorate new places that they had lived or new positions that they held. In this case, the name Qiu Ying, Qiu is the person's surname, Ying is his given name, the name he was given at birth. Shifu is the name that he received when he became an adult around the age of 20. And then this immortal of Shizhou is actually a name that Qiu Ying gave himself. It suggests that he was interested in the religion known as Taoism. The style of the signature and the seals all are kind of consonant with other works that Qiu Ying made in the 1530s, around the middle of his career. We don't know his exact birth and death dates, but he probably was born around 1494, and he probably died around 1552. Qiu Ying was a professional painter. He was born outside of the city of Suzhou, the city that inspired our Chinese garden. And he came from a non-elite family. It's known from biographies of him that he was trained as a lacquer artist, and sometime in his childhood, his painting ability was recognized. And so he was apprenticed to a professional painter named Zhou Chen, who also, of course, was active in Suzhou. Over the course of his apprenticeship and then later his own career, Qiu Ying became famous for the highly detailed works in color on silk, similar to the painting that the Huntington owns. And I'm just showing you 3 kind of random examples of great Qiu Ying paintings in color on silk. He particularly excelled in painting literary subjects. So even though he wasn't from an elite class that would have been educated in the classics, over the course of his lifetime, he seems to have become educated and became really well known for his sensitive readings of literature and his ability to translate literature into these exquisite paintings. And perhaps not surprisingly, given works like these, in his own lifetime and in subsequent centuries, he became celebrated as one of the so-called 4 great painters of the Ming Dynasty, and arguably he was the most important professional painter of the 16th century. He actually painted in many different styles. These are also works by Qiu Ying. He could do just incredibly moving works in monochrome ink on paper. And although he never wrote long inscriptions on his paintings, he actually did sign his works in a variety of calligraphic styles. He had 3 kind of major patrons. He actually lived with them at different points in his career. He was almost like a painter in residence for these 3 wealthy merchants and wealthy scholars. But he also painted for occasional clients and possibly even for sale through shops. And today, probably anyone who has any interest in Chinese painting will have come across the name Qiu Ying. If you go to any auction today of classical Chinese paintings, you'll see works attributed to or signed by him. And the reason for this is that from his own lifetime onward, he was so popular that he became the object of multiple forgeries. There probably is no other painter in Chinese painting history who was more commonly forged than was he. At the Huntington, we actually have at least 5 fake Qiu Yings. Today, his works are in major collections worldwide. Most of the examples I've shown you have been in the National Palace Museum in Taipei, just because they have really good images of their collection. but also in the Palace Museum in Beijing, the Shanghai Museum, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, all have very good Qiu Ying paintings. And I think now the Huntington is in their company. So going back to our work, there are a couple of stylistic features that I think are worth pointing out because they tell us a bit about Qiu Ying's training and his lineage. One of the kind of distinctive features of this painting are the axe-cut strokes that are used to define the facets of the rocks in passages in this work. They're kind of done with the side of the brush, almost as though the artist is like hatcheting at the rock with an axe. There are these tree roots that are sometimes evocatively called crab claw tree roots because they do evoke the claws of crabs. And then there are these kind of distant mountains in the landscape that are done in very delicate washes of color. And finally, overall, this painting is composed in what would be termed a one-corner composition. The composition really is weighted at the bottom left-hand corner, where you have the greatest density of motifs, and then it opens up as you move up and to the right. And these features, so the axe-cut strokes, the crab claw tree roots, the distant mountains, and the one-corner composition, are all features that are adapted from earlier works, going back to the 12th century, and in some cases even to the 10th century. So like 4 to 6 centuries from before this work was created. These are all features that Qiu Ying learned from his teacher, Zhou Chen, a work by whom you see on the right. You can just immediately sense how similar these painters are in terms of their style and their iconography. In Zhou Chen too, you get the same crab claw tree roots, the same axe-cut strokes, the same kinds of pigmentation, even the same like patterns of foliage in the trees. Zhou Chen himself was actually looking at works from about like two or three centuries from before his own lifetime. He was looking especially at paintings from the southern Song, and particularly works from the Imperial Painting Academy, headquartered in Hangzhou. People like Ma Yuan or Ma Lin, one of whose works you see here. This is the work on the right you're seeing is like one of the iconic works of 13th century imperial painting. And it really gives you a wonderful sense of this kind of one-corner composition, the dramatic tree roots, the axe-cut strokes, and also the distant mountains, which are being adapted by Zhou Chen, which in turn get adapted by Qiu Ying. So when you look at I think when a viewer in the past would look at our Qiu Ying painting, they would be kind of seeing the style of this work and then remembering these earlier painters, and in particular remembering these earlier imperial painters. So in that sense, the style of our work carries a certain kind of meaning. It's telling you that it's originating in a kind of place, it's originating from a place of refinement and luxury associated with the imperial court. It's the sort of style that really might have appealed to someone who wanted to showcase their own refinement and status, and probably wealth as well. So I feel pretty good about all of that. All of that's pretty truthful that I've told you so far. So now I'd like to look more at the subject matter, and this is where things become more interpretive and eventually more speculative. So the first thing, that probably captures all of our interest is the scholar in the waterside pavilion. As I mentioned earlier, Qiu Ying was actually renowned for his depictions of literary themes. And it's possible just to look at this painting and see a scholar at the height of summer admiring lotuses. That's a perfectly conventional painting topic. It doesn't necessarily have to have any poetic or literary meaning. But given Qiu Ying's literary proclivities, I think it's likely that he's thinking about a particular person, namely Zhou Dunyi, who was a philosopher during the Song dynasty in the 11th century, and who wrote an essay called On the Love for the Lotus that I think is still studied in middle schools and high schools in China and Taiwan today. It's an essay that really uses the lotus as a metaphor for an ideal gentle person. And basically, Zhou Dunyi writes, I'll give you some excerpts from the essay. He writes, "The flowers of the grasses and trees of water and land that are worthy of our love are many. But I love only the lotus, which rises from mud but remains unsullied, which bathes in clear ripples but never seeks to seduce. Clear within and straight without, it neither creeps like a vine nor forks like a branch. Its fragrance becoming ever purer with distance, it stands tall and noble. It's to be observed from afar but not dallied with up close. I say, the chrysanthemum is the recluse among flowers and the tree peony is the wealthy person of standing, but the lotus is the gentle person. Alas, after Taoyuanming, rare has been the love for the chrysanthemum, and what person has love for the lotus as I do myself? It's the love for the tree peony that suits the crowd." So Zhou Dunyi really is taking the lotus flower and kind of using it to think about the Confucian ideal of the middle path, or the middle way. The idea is that a person should be very much like the lotus, and that a person should be direct in action, should be upright in character, should be neither as excessive nor ascetic. You shouldn't be like a tree peony that's so showy and just captivates common interest. You probably shouldn't be as reclusive as a chrysanthemum, but you should, show enough of yourself, but not too much. And that kind of simultaneously poetic and ethical ideal really captured the imagination of writers and painters in subsequent centuries. We actually have a transcription of this particular essay on display in the gallery with the Qiu Ying painting. It's the subject of a hanging scroll written by a calligrapher named Terry Yuan, who's a contemporary calligrapher in Arcadia. He lives about 5 miles from the Huntington, and who actually wrote many of the placards and couplets that are featured in our Chinese garden. As many of you probably know, that we also have a pavilion in the Chinese garden called the Love for the Lotus Pavilion, which was named after this essay. And I guess somewhat remarkably, the pavilion in the painting and the pavilion in our garden, which were built totally we built the pavilion without any knowledge of this painting. Nevertheless, they have a lot of kind of wonderful visual similarities. Zhou Dunyi and Lotus, as I mentioned briefly a moment ago, really was a popular painting subject from about the 13th century onward throughout East Asia. It ended up being rendered in a variety of ways. I'm just showing you a smattering here. On the left is a Chinese version by a painter named Dai Jin, who was active about 100 years prior to Qiu Ying. On the right is a Japanese version. It's actually considered designated as a national treasure in Japan by Kano Masanobu, who was painting about a decade or two before Qiu Ying, but who was painting in a kind of style that was meant to evoke Southern Song painters. And it's interesting to see both the Kano Masanobu and the Daijin paintings together, particularly when you look at the willow trees, because the forms of the willow trees are like almost perfect mirrors of each other. It's as though they both knew the same model paintings. At bottom is another Japanese rendition from the 17th century by Kaiho Yusetsu, where instead of showing Zhou Dunyi, in a pavilion, Zhou Dunyi is now on a boat with his attendant, getting up close and personal with the lotuses. He's dallying with them a little too closely, I think. And then finally, there's this brazier that was made in China in the 17th century and ended up in Japan and was used in the tea ceremony, probably as a brazier or a charcoal container. And so even in this object that was produced more for popular consumption, you see this Zhou Dunyi-like figure on a boat admiring lotuses. And I think it's useful to see those alternate versions because it gives us a little bit of context for thinking about how the Huntington painting might have been displayed originally. If you look at the Huntington painting, we mentioned the one corner composition earlier, but one of the other distinctive features is that really the whole weight of the painting is placed on the left. There's a lot of empty space on the right. And that, to me, suggests that it was probably meant to be displayed as part of a pair of works. This is a summer work, so it could have been paired with either a spring or a autumn theme. And it turns out that in Japan, there is preserved a Chinese version of such a pair. It's this work, a pair by Dai Jin, an artist active about 100 years earlier than Qiu Ying. On the left is Zhou Dunyi Admiring Lotuses in the summer, and on the right is a rendition of the poet Li Bai viewing a waterfall. And Li Bai wrote a famous poem about viewing a waterfall. It doesn't have any seasonal markers in it, but the artist has chosen to transform it into an autumnal theme, which you can see from the kind of red leaves on some of the trees. So it's very likely, I think, that our Qiu Ying originally would have been part of such a pair or possibly part of a quartet of seasonal themes. So just to kind of, again, I feel pretty good about all of this explanation of the scholar, the scholarly subject matter. I think I can say pretty confidently that this is a painting that shares important literary kind of references or precedents with, of course, our garden, but also with a number of other works from around the same time period. We're particularly lucky that this painting was, by Qiu Ying, one of the most important artists of his time, and he was someone who was actually active in the very region that inspired our Chinese garden. I think it's relatively easy and kind of comfortable to read this as a classical painting of a literary theme, probably for a wealthy person who aspired at least to the trappings of high culture. I think the parallels, in a sense, to the Huntington are clear. It's classic, it's beautiful, it's luxurious. You look at it or you experience it, and you're immediately transported into another world. So from that perspective, it's really, I think, perfect for this institution. But I think this painting becomes a bit more complicated when we consider the other figure that's depicted in the work, namely the farmer. As we noted, really the only other point of narrative interest besides the scholar is this farmer who's in a boat picking water vegetables. He exists in striking contrast to the scholar. The farmer, there's, on the left, the scholar who is relaxed and refined and elegant. On the right, we have this farmer who is rough and hairy and bulbous and kind of rustic. It's actually not uncommon to pair a rustic figure with a very refined scholar. Typically, this is done to idealize the ostensibly carefree life of people who are unburdened by court politics, people like fishermen or woodcutters. This is clear from this painting by Liu Jun, an artist who was active about 30 years prior to Qiu Ying, where we see Zhou Dunyi admiring lotuses, and then in the bottom right, we see a fisherman playing a flute. It's a painting. This painting creates a kind of, I guess, it gives the viewer two possible life paths. It's saying, on the one hand, you can be a scholar involved potentially in court politics and in thinking deep thoughts, or on the other hand, you could be like this fisherman who escapes from such cares and can while his time playing the flute. But the Qiu Ying painting and the Liu Jun painting, are very different sorts of images. The languid flute player is very different from the laboring vegetable picker. And so from that perspective, I think the Qiu Ying painting is probably not dealing with typical ideals of rusticity and reclusion. So I think we need to think in a couple of other possible ways. I think one possibility is to read into the farmer figure a kind of consciousness of class. And I say this because Qiu Ying, as I mentioned earlier, came from a non-elite family, and he spent his life painting for very wealthy people. He lived in their houses, he worked for them, and yet he probably never was accorded quite the same respect as other members of that same class. And rather unusually, Qiu Ying is very, very sympathetic in his depictions of laborers. These are just a sample of his depictions of attendant and gardener figures from a painting that's in the Cleveland Museum of Art's collection. And what's remarkable about these figures is that he really imbues them with so much humanity. Every one of these figures has a very different, very distinctive sort of expression. You can see this guy who's carrying the bamboo is like kind of annoyed at having to carry so much bamboo. And similarly, you can see with this attendant figure that he's not just a stock character in the background, like these attendants often can be in paintings of this period. And so I think it's possible to see this farmer possibly as someone with whom Qiu Ying shared, great sympathy. And this is an idea that that came up in a conversation with another scholar of Chinese literature with whom several of my colleagues and I viewed this painting. He of course pointed out Qiu Ying's own class background. And as I have been thinking about this work and Qiu Ying's other paintings, I've come to think that this is very possible, simply because Qiu Ying does seem to have a proclivity for imbuing attendants and other kinds of laboring figures with such humanity and personality. But another possibility might be to consider the farmer in relation to other kinds of literary or painting tropes. And to do that, I think we need to know more about what this farmer is actually doing. So when you think about picking water vegetables in the context of Chinese literature or Chinese painting, usually I think there are three possibilities that come to mind. He could be picking lotus, he could be picking something called water shield, or he could be picking something called water caltrop. Since the season of the Qiu Ying painting is summer, and since the subject is Zhou Dunyi Admiring Lotus would seem to be an obvious first choice. Qiu Ying himself actually did do scenes specifically of lotus picking. This is a hand scroll that's attributed to Qiu Ying. I don't think it's actually by him, but it's in Qiu Ying's style. And in the background, you can see that there's this little boat of three women, and they're plucking they're plucking lotus blossoms from the pond. And I think the key here, though, is to emphasize that it's the male scholar in the pavilion, and then these three women on a boat picking lotuses. And this hand scroll is interesting in that the painting itself is complemented with a very long set of transcriptions of poetry about picking lotus. It turns out that picking lotus was like a whole subgenre of poetry that was like mildly erotic. In this case, the first poem, transcribed here on the right, can be translated more or less like this. It says, "After playing on the five lakes, they returned from picking lotus, the fragrance of the blossoms and leaves suffusing their robes. For you, sir, I sing this rare song, this song rare as jade, this lotus-picking tune from the Jiangnan suite." So the idea that the fragrance of these blossoms and leaves are suffusing the women's clothes is meant to be, mildly titillating to the male viewer who would have been looking at this painting. This particular poem actually was written by a man, and specifically a 5th or 6th century emperor. And he set a kind of pattern for these very mildly erotic poems about picking lotuses. So I think a work like this hand scroll was probably meant as a kind of prompt for like pleasurable reverie. And that pleasure is heightened as one looks at the image and then begins reading the poems. But of course, it's clear from the painting in the Huntington collection that this farmer isn't picking lotus. So we have to throw that possibility out the window, I think. Another possibility is that this farmer is picking a plant called water shield. Water shield looks a little bit like water lily, but it produces new leaves. Actually, it produces buds and even fruits underwater. And they're all covered with this kind of mucilaginous substance. The new leaves are picked when they're still covered with this kind of gel. And then they're boiled and transformed into a kind of very delicate porridge. And it's considered a seasonal delicacy in China. It's particularly associated with Westlake and Hangzhou. But it's also commonly eaten in Japan in the summertime. It's something that has a really amazing texture because you get the kind of slime of the gel, but also the crunch of the new leaves. And it has just a very, very subtle flavor. It's a vegetable that's still picked today. As you can see at upper left, it's usually picked by people in boats who lie on their abdomens and then are able to reach their arms down into the water and then harvest it, placing the new leaves behind them. So unlike what's depicted in Qiu Ying's painting, typically it's harvested again on the chest rather than harvested while squatting in a tub-like boat. But water shield is actually a very kind of important plant poetically. It's typically associated with the theme of reclusion, which is a theme, again, classic in Chinese literati painting. And I'm sorry for the quality of the reproduction of this painting, but it's a painting that really exemplifies perfectly the poetic imagination of water shield. It's a portrait of a scholar who had retired to live on West Lake, and it shows him fishing while two boys in a boat pick water shield. You can see a little bit more clearly here. But this pairing of water shield with fishing, specifically fishing for perch, comes from a story in the 4th century about a court official who was at court and suddenly felt the autumn wind come up. And then he started thinking about his home in southern China and started remembering water shield porridge and the pleasures of eating minced perch. And he said, I'm going to leave my job and go back home and indulge in these wonderful pleasures while living as a hermit. So that's what we're seeing in this painting, this actual 18th century scholar who retired to go live in West Lake, ostensibly to enjoy fishing while his boy attendants picked water shield. And the portrait subject even writes a poem on this painting to tell us exactly how to interpret it. He says, my home is on the banks of West Lake, with its long dike like a belt and its willow leaves like mist. A solitary boat drifts into a place of deep clouds, the water shield threads that we've picked filling it full. With water shield, what need is there for fermented beans? So fermented beans were often added as like a salty complement to dishes. So it's saying that the water shield is so delicious you can just eat it by itself. A post in officialdom is worth less than a perch. In life, there's no place one cannot go rolling and flowing with the floating clouds. So this just packages it perfectly. Water shield is meant to connote these ideals of reclusion and the idea of rejecting your official job in order to indulge in simple pleasures. But water shield really is an autumnal vegetable, which contradicts the seasonality of Qiu Ying's painting. And of course, there's also no fishing in Qiu Ying's painting. So it's possible that the farmer might allude to these kind of rustic or reclusive ideals, but it's not certain. So there's one final possibility, I think, for what this person is picking, and that's he may be picking something called water caltrop, which are the underwater fruits, again, of a plant that looks a little bit like water lily. Those fruits are harvested and then they can be boiled or roasted, almost like chestnuts. You peel the outer skin of them and then you can eat the interior flesh, which is a bit starchy and I think tastes something like chestnut or popcorn. It's something that people still commonly eat today around the time of the Mid-Autumn Festival. And it's something that's still harvested using boats that look exactly like the boat in Qiu Ying's painting. And today, the name for these boats is actually caltrop boats. So I think, and people actually pick them in precisely the way that the farmer in Qiu Ying's painting is shown. They're squatting in the boat rather than lying on their chest. But what's interesting from the perspective of poetry and painting is that, again, water caltrop is something that has an erotic connotation. There's actually a whole genre of poetry that eroticize young women picking water caltrop. I'm showing you a very late example of such a painting, but because the painting is so direct in telling you how to interpret it, I thought it would be worthwhile to show. So you see there are these three young girls who have their sleeves rolled up and they're putting their hands into the water to harvest these underwater fruits. And then the poem on the painting says, "Caltrop leaves and caltrop flowers cover the waters serene, filling the stream, all sing caltrop picking songs. Ruddy-faced maidens rock their little boats, just as though they were moving through caltrop flower mirrors." So just the one kind of footnote to the poem is that caltrop flower mirrors were the mirrors that women in the past would use to apply makeup. So the idea is that a male viewer is looking at these young girls picking these fruits and is, charmed and perhaps mildly titillated by their exposed arms and ruddy cheeks. And there are dozens and dozens of such poems that are written for men about the pleasures of observing women engaged in such an activity. So I think it's possible that Qiu Ying is playing with these kind of erotic tropes in the sense that he's transforming activities that in poetry typically were associated with young women, and he's instead giving these activities to an old farmer. He's kind of controverting our expectations, whereas we might expect to see a young woman in the background of the painting, instead we see this old man. Rather remarkably, with this comparison, you can see that the pose of the farmer even directly mirrors the pose of this maiden at the back. He too has his sleeves rolled up. His chest is somewhat bare. Even his knees are somewhat bare. For a Chinese painting, it's kind of surprising how much bare flesh is shown by this farmer. But again, actually, caltrop is an autumnal delicacy. So I can't be certain that that's actually what he's picking. But I think given his pose and given the boat, it's probably what Qiu Ying is alluding to. Regardless of what the farmer is picking, it probably has some kind of erotic connotations. And those connotations probably were associated with young women rather than old men. I think it's clear at the very least that Qiu Ying is playing with what an informed viewer might expect of such a work. And it turns out that there are other somewhat hidden erotic elements within this painting. First, if we look at all of the figures, we actually find that all three of them are much more scantily clad than they typically would be. Of course, this is to emphasize that it's very hot out. But typically, in a work that deals with summer, there would be one figure who was kind of half bare, and the others, particularly the attendants, would still be shown properly dressed to emphasize difference in class. Here, though, all three figures end up being kind of not exactly half naked, but almost. And I think that degree of bare flesh, which becomes really striking when you see the work in person, suggests that something more than just summer is at play in this painting. And the scholar himself, somewhat unexpectedly, embodies certain erotic possibilities. You'll notice that he's not just gazing at lotuses, he's actually also gazing at a pair of ducks. In Chinese painting, pairs of ducks almost always allude to matrimonial bliss. And more commonly, women would be shown gazing at such pairs of ducks. The painting on the right is a work attributed to Qiu Ying in the Shanghai Museum collection. You see this older woman looking at a pair of ducks, and the idea is that she's longing for her distant husband. The ducks then become kind of symbols of marital pleasures and also longing. But in the Huntington work, the scholar is replacing the women. It's a scholar longing for some kind of marital pleasure. He's supposed to be contemplating the lotus, but he's actually longing for something else. So that suggests that there are at least three kind of erotic elements at play in this seemingly staid work. We have vegetable picking, exposed bodies, and paired ducks. But what's curious about this actually is not the erotic connotations. There's a lot of eroticism in Chinese painting that goes unnoticed. What's unusual is that in this case, all of the figures are men. And that's suggesting that's pointing to, I think, a kind of homoeroticism that was actually very normative in early modern China. Same-sex marriage or same-sex relationships were not disparaged. And in certain periods, same-sex relationships, particularly between men, but also between women, were encouraged as a complement to opposite-sex marriage. There wasn't really a strict dividing line between homosexuality and heterosexuality. Rather, particularly from the late 16th century onward, it arguably was the norm for elite people to engage in what we would today call bisexual practices. What's worth noting, though, is that in literature about such sexual practices, it's usually young male servants who are idealized as the objects of same-sex desire. It's very unusual for older men to be involved in such depictions. And to me, that suggests that the painter, again, is kind of playing with expectations. He's pointing to a kind of non-normative mode of sexual desire. This is not to say that it's an erotic painting, but it is to say that it's a painting that's potentially playing with eroticism and playing with Vera's expectations of what is and is not normative. So when I think about the painting as a whole, I kind of imagine that it had to have been made at the behest of a specific client, someone who was interested in conventional literati subject matter, but someone who wanted to twist that subject matter in a specific kind of queer way. But again, none of this is certain. There's nothing written on the painting or written about the painting to kind of guarantee that these interpretations are correct. So with that, I just would like to offer a couple of final words about what I think the significance of this work might be. I think there are probably two ways to conclude. One is to say that I think the painting's useful for thinking about how to interpret paintings in the absence of written documentation, of display context, and even of directly comparable works. It, of course, reminds us to do what art connoisseurs and historians have always done, which is to look at literary sources and to think about how painters and painting transforms words into something visual. But more importantly, I think the painting encourages us to look beyond conventional surfaces. Most Chinese paintings are not really about what they appear to depict. There's usually some kind of subtext, and art historians typically tend to interpret such subtexts in the light of politics. That makes sense for a lot of paintings. Actually, pre-modern viewers who viewed paintings often would write inscriptions on them explaining through kind of veiled language how the subject matter of the painting related to political or social situations of the time. But as the Qiu Ying painting suggests, there can be many kinds of subtext. There can be playful subtexts, and there can even be erotic subtexts. The difficulty, of course, is that subtexts are never explicit. That's kind of the point. So it becomes difficult to prove them. But these kind of paintings, I think, demand that a viewer be open-minded and that we look and compare broadly. These aren't particularly new or profound ideas, but this is a painting that somehow forced me to confront these ideas in ways that I hadn't before. And while thinking about this painting, I've been continually inspired by an essay by an art historian named Laura Blanchard, who wrote a really wonderful article about a painting that shows a 12th century Chinese hand scroll showing women preparing newly woven silk. It's a short hand scroll attributed to Emperor Huizong in the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It's really a canonical work in Chinese painting history, and it seems very anodyne. But Blanchard, through very close reading of poetry, is able to show that this theme of women preparing newly woven silk fundamentally is a sexual theme. And so ultimately this work that was produced at the behest of the emperor becomes a work that's about his own desire and his own ability to sort of control these women in his orbit. Actually, I think a lot of Chinese painting has such undertones. These erotic and hopefully, in the case of the Qiu Ying painting, at least playful undertones. But for much of the 20th and parts of the 21st centuries, many of us have been kind of out of touch with earlier and sometimes more open forms of sexuality. The other, and perhaps easier or more relevant way to conclude is to consider what this painting means or does for the Huntington. I think it's a painting whose complexity and kind of indeterminacy makes it perfect for the institution right now. Qiu Ying was someone who painted for rich people, who were like the Henry Huntingtons of their time. He was someone who understood literature and who could play with it. He could play with literature in a very straightforward way, but he could also play with literature in very unexpected, playful, and even queer ways. Qiu Ying was also someone who was sympathetic to outsiders. And the Huntington itself has become more and more conscious of accessibility and diversity recently. We've been welcoming new audiences and collecting materials that speak to the lives of more diverse peoples than we've ever collected before. We've also been thinking deeply about how class and race have been racial dynamics have been fundamental to our institution's success. I think this painting actually packages many of these issues in a really fine and quite beautiful way. So the painting is on view for another month in the Huntington Art Gallery. I hope you'll take some time to view it, and I hope some of these comments might be useful in complicating the way you might approach it. Thank you. So we have time to take questions. Michelle, I think, will circulate a microphone. Because this is recorded and shown on YouTube, we ask that you speak into the microphone so that other people watching on the video can hear.
Two things. Where's the painting going after March the 4th? Because it's not been up very long. And the other thing is that I'm struck by the isolation of that courtyard. It's not near any other buildings, and there are, just, you say, just those three people. Would you suggest that there's a big house somewhere off screen, whatever? And also, to me, I think that the difference between the man surveying the lotus and the farmer is a direct portrayal of class distinction. And being English, I'm very well aware of all that. And so that's how I see that. And you kind of brought it up in other paintings as well. So I'm interested by what you have to say about that, but especially about the isolation of this scene.
So I'll start with the easy question. The painting will go back into storage after March 4th. We can only show, so works that are rendered on paper or silk typically can only be shown for 3 to 4 months every 5 years, depending on the intensity of the light in the gallery in which they're shown. So we will have shown this painting for about 3 months now. It will go into storage to rest for about 4 years, and then we'll have an exhibition, I think in 2027, focusing on depictions of Chinese gardens that will feature this painting again. The question of the isolation of the pavilion and the landscape is a bit hard to answer, but I think it's kind of a conceit that recurs throughout a lot of painting, that there are these isolated pavilions from which you can appreciate an untouched landscape. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. If it were paired, if we had the other painting or paintings with which this were originally paired, we might, have a fuller vision. I don't think we would have a full vision of a garden, but we might have a vision of a more populated landscape. And I think you're totally right that one of the things that this painting does highlight is precisely that class difference between the scholar and the laborer. And that's really something that Qiu Ying, I think, highlights throughout many of his works, is class distinction. I guess what's interesting to me about Qiu Ying in comparison to many other painters is that he seems I don't want to say comfortable highlighting it, but I guess he is kind of comfortable highlighting it, and he's also comfortable depicting people from lower classes, whereas other painters might tend to depict them in a more stock figure-like manner. He gives kind of more depth to these otherwise background figures that many painters would ignore. So I do think that's one of kind of the hallmarks of his work, is highlighting those class differences.
I have a comment and a question. I know barely anything about the poet, but just based on the description of the poem, and I'm curious as to whether you see something deeper in the comparison of the three flowers, the chrysanthemum, the peony, and the lotus. And as a cultural anthropologist, the first thing I thought about is social mobility, and that education and being a scholar, passing the exams, will be your route to social mobility. So, and the poem states about growing from the mud, being solid, and yet being a very proper, gentle person. So I was wondering, I know that the artist is from a working class or background. I was just wondering whether he could be also pointing to the potential of social mobility. That means anybody in the figure who is not educated could still rise up like a lotus from very humble beginnings to become a scholar.
Thank you very much for your comment. That's very interesting. I'd not thought about lotus specifically in relation to social mobility, but in the Buddhist context, which I'm actually more familiar with, you're right that the kind of growth of a lotus is likened to personal change. So one can go from being a mud-like human to blossoming into spiritual awakening. So I think it's possible that Qiu Ying is picking up on that in this essay, but I guess I don't know if I've ever seen commentaries on historical commentaries on this essay reading the lotus in such a light. They typically take it in a more kind of at face value, that the author of the essay, Zhou Dunyi, really is just focusing on the kind of physical qualities of the lotus blossom, rather than thinking about the capacity of that plant for change and the capacity of humans themselves for change.
Hi, Dr. Bloom. Thank you very much for this lecture. I'll have to admit that everything that you shared with us is a lot more than what my limited imagination would have thought of by looking at this particular painting. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts. My question is, going forward, do you think that the Huntington is going to continue to acquire additional art from China similar to this? And how did this particular painting come, or how did the Huntington come across this particular opportunity to acquire this painting?
Thank you very much for your question. So I think one of the exciting things right now is that last year the Huntington released a new strategic plan for the institution that did speak to the importance of diversifying our collections, botanical, library, and art. And one of the priorities for the diversification of the art museum will be the acquisition of Asian art. So this year actually will be the first time that Asian artworks are included in our Collectors Council Gala. So we now will have probably an annual means of increasing our holdings of Asian art specifically. And I'm very hopeful that we're going to find some other ways of building our collection of East Asian art as well. We've been lucky recently in that we've received a couple of very nice donations besides this painting that have dramatically increased our holdings. But this particular work, as the credit line indicates, was purchased with funds from Jun and Simon Lee. So Simon Lee is one of our trustees, and Jun Lee was the founding curator of the Chinese Garden. They've been, dedicated supporters of the Chinese Garden for almost 20 years now. But they also came across this particular work in London at the gallery of a dealer named Paul Moss. It's the Sydney L. Moss Gallery. This was a painting that had been in an American collection for about 20 years. It had been in an American collection since about 1991, something like that. The owners passed away, and then their descendants consigned it to the Moss Gallery to sell to benefit their family's foundation. And Jun and Simon saw this painting. Of course, they recognized the subject matter and thought about its connections to the Chinese Garden. And, once that kind of connection was made, it was hard not to buy it, I think. So we were very, very fortunate that through some kind of serendipitous chance, they came across it. I didn't mention this in the talk, but so the painting had been in an American collection after 1989. It actually was purchased at auction in Sotheby's that year in 89. It seems to have been sold by a Chinese or Chinese-American family. I'm assuming a Chinese-American family that probably was in New York. Given that it was sold in 1989, I assume the family probably came to the US from China sometime around 1949. So it's a work whose kind of history isn't able to be traced very well prior to that moment, but it's a work that really is perfect for this institution, and for which I think I and many others here are very grateful to Jun and Simon Lee.
So on a more mundane technical note, do you have any kind of idea of how long a painting like this would take to create, from inception to completion?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. It would take a couple of months, I think. I think works like this would be produced in a couple of stages. So there would be, the initial underdrawing, probably the refinement of the underdrawing, the gradual building up of pigments, and then eventually the outlining. So ink does, of course, dry pretty quickly. It dries a lot faster than oils. But for the ink and the mineral and vegetal pigments to dry, you have to wait a little bit of time to ensure that everything really is stable. So I think typically, I don't think the studio would be working on this every day for 3 months, but I think they would have been working on it several days over the course of multiple months. And as we saw in some of the details, there's just so much pigment that requires, very meticulous rendering, and all of that takes a lot of time. Qiu Ying was, so the Los Angeles County Museum of Art did a major exhibition on Qiu Ying in the spring of 2020 that opened like a month before the world shut down because of COVID. And they included probably 50 or so works that are kind of that can be definitively stated to be by Qiu Ying. And if we have 50 works that are extant today, that would have meant that he and his studio produced hundreds of works during his lifetime. So this was one of many such works that existed at one time.
Mentioning that exhibit at LACMA, what gives us some confidence that this is not a fake?
Thank you. That's a good question, too. Well, one thing that gives us confidence is that the curator at LACMA said in writing that it's real, so twice. But the thing that really gives us confidence, or that gives me confidence, I should say, is that the second seal on here, the Immortal of Shizhou seal, that only appears on 2 other works by Qiu Ying, and both of which are widely accepted to be by him. And I think the fact that this seal was used rarely by him suggests that a forger probably wouldn't have known to forge it. The other seal, Shifu, appears on many, many, many works by and attributed to Qiu Ying, so it's not one that we can really use to be certain. The signature itself also compares very favorably to a couple of other paintings that are widely accepted to be by him. And then, style doesn't count for much with Qiu Ying because he could paint in so many different styles, but it does feel right in comparison to other works by him. It's not like as densely painted as some of his works. The motifs are not as dense, there's not as much pigmentation, there's not as much detail as with some of the paintings, so it probably wasn't made for his wealthiest patrons. But it does compare well to other works from the 1530s in the middle of his career.
When you're talking about the fakes, are they contemporaneous fakes or are they more modern fakes?
Both. So in his own lifetime, there were fakes, which it's a complicated question. So he had a studio. His own daughter, Choju, became a painter. Her husband also was a painter. So they all probably were working on things together, and because things signed with his name would sell for more money, they probably used his name, even though the younger generation was painting them. That was common in studios throughout East Asia in all periods. But there were also probably contemporaneous studios producing works that were spuriously signed with his name. And then in subsequent centuries, many, many studios were producing works, and that continues to the present. We have, and it also was true across countries in East Asia. So in the Huntington, we have 2 paintings that have a Qiu Ying signature, but they're probably Japanese, for example. There are lots of works like that. I'm pretty sure there must be Korean examples as well that have spurious signatures of Qiu Ying probably from like the 17th to 19th centuries.
When I look at Chinese painting, even though I'm a Chinese, I'm always feel kind of lost. I mean, when you look at a Gainsborough painting, you know they are talking about essence and the beauty they aspired. Then you look at a Goya's painting, you understand. And when I look at Edward Munch's painting about fear, intuitively you can feel the painting, the fear. But when I look at Chinese painting, for this just particular painting, I'm still lost. I don't know what it tried to tell me. And when you look at when you talk about subtext, from your point of view, exactly what the subtext is, what is the focus of this whole painting?
Well, have you seen it in person?
No, when I look at it, I don't know what it's trying to tell me.
Well, I think when you go and see it in person, it becomes a little bit easier to make sense of. When you get up close to it, I think your eye really is immediately drawn to this scholar figure. The whiteness of his robe immediately draws you in. And then you start looking at him and you start tracing where he's looking, and you see, oh, he's looking at these lotuses, and then, oh, there are some nice ducks floating on the pond, and then your eye kind of floats through the painting, and eventually you get to the waterfall, and you start to get the feeling of the oppressive heat of summer that's being cooled by the waterfall, by the breeze that's blowing off of these lotuses. And I think, there typically is a path that a viewer's eye is supposed to follow through a Chinese painting. Usually, a painting is structured so that there's a sort of S-curve where you are taken from the foreground into the middle ground and then up into the background. And by tracing that S-curve, which is suggested through the prominence of different motifs, and also through the suggestion of different layers of mist and the layering of the rocks, you are taken on a kind of spatial journey through the landscape. But in terms of what the painting is trying to tell us, I think that's where it becomes interesting to look more specifically at the figures and then trying to think about how figures relate to literature. I think almost all Chinese painting is not really interpretable without some knowledge without a lot of knowledge of literature, which usually is opaque to me, to be honest. I almost never can understand a painting at first until I spend a lot of time reading about reading poetry and other forms of literature on similar subjects. That kind of knowledge was common to the people for whom these paintings were made. I think it's much like with the garden at the Huntington, the Chinese garden at the Huntington. When you walk into the garden, you see calligraphy all over the place. For a modern viewer, regardless of whether or not you can read Chinese, some of that writing is not going to make much sense. But for a pre-modern viewer who would have known the poems from which those writings were taken, those are all meaningful things. They all tell you how to interpret certain areas of the garden. And I think painting really functions in much the same way. You're meant to approach these paintings with a certain body of literature in your head that you and other members of your social class would have shared. So at least for me, Chinese painting really of all genres and all periods up to the 20th century is something that, it's very difficult because we don't quite have the right literary backdrop. And I mean, the same thing for me. I was born and raised in the West, and yet when I look at, because I have very little knowledge of Greek mythology or Roman mythology and biblical literature. A lot of Renaissance and Baroque painting is opaque to me. I can certainly see, the dynamism of the brushwork, but I have no idea what the painting is actually about because I lack the literary knowledge. So I think, a lot of forms of cultural production in all cultures in the past really was predicated on the sharing of a knowledge of literature and a knowledge of philosophy by members of the same social class. And we've lost all of that through the dramatic social upheavals of the past 150 years.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Chinese painting is difficult, but European painting is too. So I think with that, we might draw to a close. Thank you very much for listening to me for so long. And please do go see the painting, but please also join us for the next lecture in this Center for East Asian Gardens lecture series. The next talk will be online only. It will be given by Yukiel Lippert, I think on Thursday, March 28th at 4 p.m. Professor Lippert from Harvard will be speaking about Japanese architectural traditions in relation to our Shoya house. And we'll have one more talk in the spring in person here in April by Professor David Howell of Harvard, who will be talking about recycling and sustainability in Japan, again in relation to the Shoya house. So thank you all.